All right, let's talk about inflation and the national debt. And I must admit, this one is pretty difficult because, well, I'll put it this way. The more confident somebody is about, the national debt, the more likelihood that they don't know what they're talking about. I'm really interested in economics. I've been really like intently listening to a ton of different economist debate, and quite frankly, I would say we're running an experiment, like Warren Buffett said, that nobody knows. Literally nobody knows. People have theories. I side with one camp over another, but it's pretty impossible to tell right now. And what is that? Does the American huge national debt, how is that going to affect growth? How is that going to affect spending? Is there a tipping point to where you get a certain amount of debt and then the country can't pay it back anymore? One of the adding complexities here is this. If one country was very fiscally responsible, then you could kind of look at, like, compare the countries. But the problem is, all major economies, I think Singapore is pretty fiscally responsible. It doesn't run up debt, but that's a small country. All big countries, China, Germany, Europe, well, Germany not so much, but all the major European countries, Japan, big one, China, they're all running up huge debts and doing government spending. So it's, yes, investors want to invest money, put their money into safe assets, but the problem is there's a safe asset shortage. They don't have anywhere to go. They can put it in the Chinese currency or the euro or whatever, but I mean, I guess the dollar is the least worst of them. It would be kind of interesting to see if there is a country that comes along, like a big legit economy, Western economy, that actually gets its house in order and doesn't run up a debt and doesn't print money. Would that country grow economically? Would it become the reserve currency? Would people stop buying U.S. government debt? Who knows? But here's one thing. The liberal economists like Paul Krugman, they would advocate that, hey, but he's not the only one that advocates, is this. For the past 10 years, we had really low inflation. And that's true. And we could borrow money really cheaply, and that's true. So we got into a lot of debt. We borrowed a lot of money. And you're saying, hey, because the inflation is low, we could have kept going. We could have done much more of this. We could have had free health care, so people wouldn't have to, how awesome would it be, how awesome like our economy would grow if nobody had to worry about health care, or how well would our economy grow if how much the people's wages would grow if the government was also hiring people, handing out jobs, and like the Green New Economy or whatever government would make work projects that would make labor more scarce, that would push up wages. Technically, you can even cut taxes, and then that would spur growth. So basically, you could find a lot of uses for free money. The problem is, what type of negative, deleterious effects would it have? In people in the Paul Krugman camp would say nothing. Well, our interest rates are really low. We can borrow as much as we want, and if anyway, we own the debt. We owe it to ourselves because there's a lot of American people that buy this government debt. I mean, I don't want to get into that technicality, but a lot of the U.S. government debt is not 30-year fixed debt. It's actually it rolls over, and I think something that's too good to be true is probably too good to be true. It's like you found like a billionaire's credit card that you can use and charge and run up, and then it's like, and then the billionaire or whatever just like passed away, just doesn't know whatever, or it's like unlimited. It's like it's not possible. I don't think. I'm in the camp that it's while it is possible that the government, nobody knows where the tipping point is, to where you could have a sovereign money debt crisis or sovereign dollar crisis, or the dollar lose reserve currency status. The problem is growth. The more indebted a country is, the slower it grows. And once you slow down economic growth, because growth is compounded, once you slow down economic growth, it's many generations in the future that are going to be suffering, that are going to be much poorer, because we wanted to spend some kind of money for social programs today, but the population of the United States today is much smaller than the many future generations that are going to come in America. Now, why would somebody follow this? Because I mean, conservatives have been, beating the drum about, this is the debt, whatever, we're at 10 trillion, 20 trillion, and they were kind of wrong so far. They were Chicken Littles, and not, the government keeps getting more and more debt, and it's so far so good. No disaster of that type. That doesn't mean it can't happen in the future, but it's not like one person is going to realize the folly of the U.S. government, start yelling from the rooftop, and they're going to change. The only reason why to follow this is interesting is for investment purposes, if you think that the U.S. has unsustainable debt, they won't be able to control inflation. Well, maybe you buy assets that do well with inflation. Yeah, but this is a really complicated topic. I mean, really smart people on both sides say we can have inflation. Other people say with deflation. There's the dollar milkshake theory, where it says that the dollar, even though the U.S. government is doing a whole bunch of profligate things, other currencies, for whatever reason, are going to get stuck, and the U.S. dollar and assets and all the U.S. stocks are going to go through the roof. And it was by a really, really smart investment guy, so I'm not going to claim I'm smarter than him. I'm lost. I don't know, but I'm on the sidelines, going to see how this plays out. So I have a Reason article here, and they're trying to say that America's huge pile of national debt makes combating inflation more difficult. Is that true? Who knows? I mean, at first they can if they want to stop the inflation, they could just stop the quantity. They don't need to hike interest rates, really, yet. They could actually stop throwing fuel on the fire. Basically, they can just stop buying assets. That was the first thing. But I would guess, if I was a betting man and I had to guess, I would say they would stop buying the assets, stop quantitative easing. They would have one or two small little rate hikes that are just more for show, and some other crisis will come along that the Fed will have to step in and lower the rates and start buying assets again. So I think they're caught. All these nations, I think, are caught in this vicious trap that they can't get out of. They can't normalize rates ever again. I think it's impossible. So the article says optimistic scenario. America leaves a pandemic, and spending plans are also allowing the 2017 tax cut to expire. Economy performed consistently and well for the next 3 decades. We dodge recessions, wars, climate issues, anything else the world might throw our way. Under that set of circumstances, national debt would be merely twice the size of the U.S. economy by the middle of the century. Is that a bad thing? Who knows? Maybe it's other countries are going to be a lot more indebted, so maybe U.S. is going to look pretty peachy and people still be buying the U.S. government debt. in the last 2 years, we have taught us anything, of course, that the crisis can appear with little warning. The federal government is already more than 23 trillion in debt early 2020, but has borrowed about 6 trillion more since then, much of it to fund the pandemic era stimulus bill. I wonder how much more. I mean, people are suffering due to inflation, so is there political will to spend more? Joe Manchin says no. Pandemic era debt isn't the main cause of debt tsunami that's threatening to wash over the government in the next few decades. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, decades of spending more than the government takes are the real culprits. But so much borrowing in so short period of time has heightened the stakes. Well, that is true, and the problem that I hear is the Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. Well, Social Security is probably tied to inflation. Medicare and Medicaid are actually real services, so they can't inflate that away. Because if they were trying to inflate that away, the healthcare was going to the healthcare's cost is going to rise. So it's not like we owe China a couple trillion and we can just use inflation to inflate away the debt. No, we owe people real services. With inflation running at 40-year high, Federal Reserve has indicated that it will consider raising interest rates early next year. That's standard issue monetary policy and basic microeconomics, but America's high levels of debt make the maneuver more fraught because of higher interest rates that will reverberate through the government's own debt. Yes, and here's the thing. Hiking interest rates, that's another crucial thing that a lot of progressives and the people on the left probably gloss over or just don't want to mention. That the U.S. is a big borrower, and if we need to hike interest rates, the U.S. government has to pay a higher interest on its debt, and the more indebted it is, the harder it would be to pay these interest rates on the already huge debt. The fiscal policy has hamstrung the Federal Reserve, said Brian Riedel, senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, a former state budget officer. In a new report, Riddle outlines the fiscal and monetary trap facing federal policymakers and central bankers. In short, raising interest rates will make the nation's debt a bigger problem, and already huge national debt makes more difficult to combat inflation. Inflation has been triggered, at least in part, by dead finance spending. Yeah, well, the issue is all countries are experiencing inflation. So there isn't for investors or people that need safe assets, there isn't a better alternative. So the dollar is the worst place, if you don't think about it that way. In effect, decade of low inflation and low interest rates taught politicians that there were no immediate budgetary reason to limit borrowing. The long-term risk of massive debt was always there, but politicians are nothing if not good at ignoring the problems that won't metastasize until they're out of office. Totally true. This is likely no longer the case, in the same way that high interest credit card is more expensive to pay than a lower interest rate car loan. High interest rate rates will add the annual cost of servicing the federal debt. Even if Congress didn't authorize another penny of borrowing, it's okay to laugh. Annual payments on the debt will grow if interest rates rise. The Congressional Budget Office, CBO, Long-Term Budget Outlook, which serves as a baseline for projections regarding the future debt cost and other budgetary matters, assumes that interest on the national debt will rise to 8.6% of gross domestic product by 2051. That's about 1.9 trillion in today's dollars. The funny thing is, I mean, a lot of people, that's so far in the future. A lot of people don't even know they're going to be alive by then. Although, so they don't care about it that much. But then again, the left is all up in arms about global warming. That's supposed to crush us in the future. Well, this is a huge problem in the future that they completely ignore. political reasons, because I guess the underlining thing is that that's a conservative talking point, because if you actually take the debt seriously, well, shit, you need to cut services, you need to raise taxes. Both very, very unpopular. That's the rosy scenario I described at the beginning. The future where there is no unexpected borrowing splurges and no massive economic disruptions. Even so, this scenario means that interest on the debt will be the largest portion of the federal budget. It will consume about half of all projected tax revenue. So that's it's about in 30 years. What if interest rates exceed the CBO's projection? At 1 percentage point increase in the interest rate translate into 30 trillion increase in the interest costs. That's roughly equivalent to what the country expects to spend on the military over the same amount of time. It will cause interest rates cost to consume 13% of GDP by 2051, equal to about 70% of all projected tax revenue by that year. So yeah, just the interest on the debt is going to be the biggest line item. I wonder if that's going to happen anytime soon. Or how are the public going to react? Because the way it plays out now, you voice your concern about the national debt, and then the left politicians be like, oh, well, that's a right-wing talking point. What are you, Republican, conservative? You just want to cut grandma's Social Security or whatever. And then, I wonder, so they're in that type of denial mode about it, like that you're a conspiracy theorist. And at what point in time and what year a baseline Democrat like Joe Biden would have to admit, you know what, guys, the debt is a problem. We haven't been talking about it, but yeah, it's like, and then they'll try to make it seem like, well, we got to level with the American people. So it's like you knew about that problem before, but you were dishonest. But now the problem is so unbearable. Now even the left would have to address it. What year would that be? Once the debt surges, even modest interest rate movements can impose stratospheric costs. It's those stratospheric costs that the Federal Reserve must consider before deciding to raise interest rates. That's not supposed to be part of the Federal Reserve's purview, but years of fiscal profligacy from Congress have created a mess central bank is ill-suited to solve. The central bank may decide that it's better to let inflation run its course than to risk precipitating a debt crisis, but that's a decision that would have dire consequences too. Consumers will pay higher prices, workers will see real wages decreased, and anyone try to save for retirement will see those savings eat away by inflation. For too long, federal policy regarding the national debt has been driven by a sense that the good times will never come to an end. Low inflation and falling interest rates may have lulled the politicians into a false sense of security, and poor budgeting left the nation's balance sheet vulnerable to coming crisis of the government's own making. Yeah, that's the libertarian conservative take, but I'm going to make a guess here that the U.S. can get Japan is a lot more indebted, like 200% of the GDP, or Japan's a lot more indebted. They're just experiencing shit economic growth. Is it possibly because they're declining birth rates of their immigration? But it's probably have to do with this, their monetary policy of having a bunch of debt. So I'm going to make a wild guess and say this debt is not going to be a huge problem, but it is going to stifle growth. And unfortunately, it's like a hidden killer. People can point to the real tragedy of this is people can point to things like that the government does, like, oh, they made a road, that's nice. Oh, it gave grandma health care, that's nice. People can see those tangible things, but they don't see with their eyes the debt that the U.S. government's racking up, causing lower growth. So they don't see, they can't blame.